I'm Julian Friedmann. I'm an agent, and I'm going to try and talk to you from an agent's point of view. And you may not realize it, but agents are in the business of rejection. We reject a lot of people all the time. At my agency, we get about 6,000 submissions from writers every year, and we probably do not take on more than 6 writers a year. So we know that there are millions of people who want to write, who want to tell stories, but we also know that most of the time what they write isn't very good. In fact, it's extremely boring. And I really want to try and demystify the process, because it appears that storytelling is somewhat mysterious. There are many experts, they disagree fundamentally on lots of things. And I think we need to start by looking at a really important question, which is, why is it so difficult? And the answer is partly because you've got to remember the story is much more about the audience than it is about the characters or the plot, and it's much more about the audience than it is about the storyteller. I would even say that storytelling cannot be taught. I don't think it's the proper study for writers. I'm involved in setting up writing courses, so I must admit that I also jump on that bandwagon. But I say this because I've worked with writers for 40 years. I've been an editor, publisher, an agent, executive producer. I'm in awe of writers. I'm filled with admiration for them. It takes an incredible amount of courage to put your soul on paper and have people who are probably much less talented than you, certainly much less creative than you, trample all over it. Agents are often derided. We have a bad press, which actually is fine. Someone once said to me, you know, oh, you're a really good agent. I said, don't tell people that. I want to be known as someone who's nasty. Good agent was once described to me as a marriage broker, and a bad one as a pimp. And we are trying to develop long-term relationships, but it's difficult. There's this story about why in Hollywood scientists who are at the cutting edge of research into the latest cures for cancer are now using agents rather than rats. And there are 5 reasons for this. The first is that people in California are crazy. The second is the animal liberation movement are targeting scientists who are experimenting on rats. The third is there are now more agents in California than there are rats. Fourth is you can't get emotionally involved with an agent. And finally, there are some things that rats won't do. I now want to talk about adultery, because writers need to be unfaithful. And with due respect to anyone here who's religious, the Holy Trinity, adultery and the Holy Trinity. For me, the Holy Trinity in my life and my work is the writer, the characters, and the audience. As a writer, you live with your characters for a long time. You nurture them. After all, you create them. You have a kind of fidelity towards them. But your audience, you very rarely meet them. You certainly, if you're going to be successful, will never meet more than a minute proportion of them. They probably have prejudices and tastes that completely differ from yours. You probably wouldn't want to know what their personal hygiene was like. And basically, you're just there to thrill them, to turn them on, to titillate them, and by doing so yourself, and then leave them. So your primary relationship has got to be with your audience, not with your characters. Now, if the proper study for writing is not right, what is it? I think it's human behavior. It's why people behave the way they do, why they are so irrational, why they can do such outrageous and terrible things. Irrationality is really quite interesting. My mother always used to win arguments with me by saying, don't be rational about my neuroses. And there are some experts, some people who've written about screenwriting who I think are very good. The majority, I think, are not. Leos Egri wrote a book called The Art of Dramatic Writing. And what's interesting is the subtitle. The subtitle is its basis in the creative understanding of human motivation. So that's what writers should be doing. Now, we know that millions of people want to write. Why? What is it that compels people to tell stories? George Orwell wrote a book, which is probably his least well-known book, but I think is possibly his best book. It's called Why I Write. And he describes why he writes, but he also says he thinks it applies to the majority of writers. And there are 4 reasons he gives. And the most important and comprehensive one is sheer egotism. Sheer egotism. The other reasons are immortality, getting back at people who put you down, and trying to make the world a better place. Samuel Johnson would not have agreed with him. He is famous for having said, "No man but a blockhead ever wrote but for money." He also said, one of my favorite quotes about writing, when he was asked to read someone's manuscript, "Your work is both good and original. Unfortunately, the part that is good is not original, and the part that is original is not good." So I believe that stories define us, not language. It's often said language is what defines us. But you know, dolphins have language, whales have language, elephants have language, chimpanzees have language, but they don't, as far as we know, have stories, despite Planet of the Apes. Most of the books about screenwriting and most of the courses tell you there is no formula. Many of them also tell you must write out of your own experience, which is one of the main reasons why most of the stories a lot of these people write are very boring. Most of us have pretty boring lives. Or is there a formula? Years ago I was studying under Frank Daniel, a famous teacher, and we asked him if when in a pre-literate society, in other words, before there was any writing, when the old wise men sat round the campfire telling moral tales to try and bind the clan together, given that they'd not read Sid Field or Robert McKee, would they have used the 3-act structure? Frank said the 3-act structure is actually a function of how the human brain works. You plant a piece of information, it pays off. You have to have a beginning to get to the middle, to get to the end. Sometimes it's said the British film industry doesn't work like that. It has a beginning, a muddle, and an end. Actually, Aristotle then described the formula, and he did that 2,500 years ago. Not only did it work then, it still works today. So actually, anyone who says there's no formula is wrong, there is. And Aristotle did it in a way that makes it incredibly easy to remember. There's 3 words: pity, fear, and catharsis. He said you need to make the audience feel pity for a character. You do that usually by making the character go through some undeserved misfortune. What that does is it enables the audience to emotionally connect with the character. And once the writer has got that emotional connection between the audience and the character, the writer begins to have some control over the audience. You then put the character into a worse and worse and worse situation. And because of the emotional connection, the identification, the audience feels fear. When you release the character from the jeopardy or whatever the situation they're in, the audience experiences a catharsis. Pity, fear, catharsis. Now, the catharsis is actually the result not of any intellectual activity, but of chemicals being released in the bloodstream, notably one called phenylethylamine, otherwise known as PEA, or the happiness drug. Now, you can actually cause that release in your bloodstream by taking speed or ecstasy. If you want to be a bit more legal, eating chocolate or having sex. So we can try and save the British film industry by giving bars of chocolate to people who go in to see British films. They'll come out of there and tell their friends they had a really good time. But just so you can see, this is not specific to a 2,500-year-old Greek. I found in the program notes of a series of Beethoven concerts given by Maurizio Pollini this very interesting quote. Beethoven's preference for happy endings is not by any means a tendency towards kitsch, but rather a musical style akin to Schiller's philosophy of suffering, struggle, and overcoming. So you can see the pattern: suffering, struggle, and overcoming. Pity, fear, catharsis, beginning, middle, and end. It works. It's always worked, and it always will work. So if you comprehend all this and you can do this in your writing, will you write better? No, probably not. You need more. You need to understand how audiences actually use stories, why we need stories, what we do with them. And there's a really interesting example. For years, people have known about these cave paintings that were done 25,000 years ago, the famous caves in Lascaux in southwest France. No one's ever really concluded what the paintings meant. Paintings of animals with little drawings of stick people. Now, if you know about the Maasai, when they go from being boys to men, these kids have to go and live in the bush. They have a spear, and they have to kill a lion. It's really dangerous. And what do? Well, we know that they get very drunk. We know they do a lot of rhythmic dancing until they get into a kind of trance. And I think that those prehistoric caves were the earliest cinemas. I think that the hunters would go into the caves and they would look at the animals and they would imagine the fear that they would feel when they went out into the savannah or the bush to face bears, wild boars, mammoth elephants, saber-toothed tigers. They rehearsed their fear. And I think that's what we use literature for, it's what we use theatre for, it's what we use cinema for. So if you now know that, you can think, well, now what have I got to do to enable the audience to have experiences which they can then relate to themselves? Is that enough? And actually it's not. Particularly if you're working in film, you've got to understand that we in Europe have evolved a very different means of telling stories for cinema than the Americans did. We know that 80% of all box office in Europe goes to American movies. American movies travel far better than ours. Why? Well, they have bigger budgets, they can spend more money on development, they have bigger stars. We can't really compete with that. That's a given. It's an uneven playing field. They also have very accessible characters, and they also like sentimental happy endings. It's very common in the British press to see something saying, "Great film, what a shame it was so sentimental." Well, we can do it when we need to. We've done For Weddings, Trainspotting, Bend It Like Beckham, Billy Elliot, East is East. They all did phenomenally well. So the solutions are, you have to have accessible characters that the audience will emotionally engage with. You need upbeat endings if possible, because we know statistically that they like it. Then there's the question of dialogue. American movies have only 2/3 the dialogue of European movies. And this is really important because it means their movies can communicate to audiences who don't have a high level of education, who aren't even literate. I can explain why in more detail, but I'm not going to because I'm going to run out of time. The other thing that American movies do is they tell their stories much more visually because they aren't using dialogue. So they think almost in storyboards. And this is important for a very simple psychological reason. We believe what we see. We don't believe what we hear. And in fact, a really clever script will sometimes have dialogue contradicting what you're seeing because it makes the audience wake up, and instead of leaning back as a passive spectator, they will lean forward as an active participant in the process of watching your film. We can do that. The other thing we can do, but we don't, is shorter scenes. I was told by a company that does dubbing and subtitling that American movies, on average, have scenes half the length of European movies. It's a huge difference. Now, if you have your scenes, you cut the beginning and the end of every scene out without taking out anything that's critical to the understanding of the film. You leave a gap, and the audience will fill in that gap. And in doing so, it makes them feel good. They are actively watching your film instead of passively watching it. It doesn't cost anything to cut out dialogue. It also, by the way, gives the composer much more room to use music. And as we know, music is a much stronger way of connecting emotionally than words. And since your job is to try and create that emotional connection, you should. Now, I started out by saying we're in the business of rejection. Diana Rigg edited a book once about the worst reviews ever given of theatre plays, and it was called No Turn Unstoned. And I think in a way we need to face the fact that there are going to be people who criticize what writers do, what creative people do, and writers have got to get rejected. All great writers have had lots of rejections. We know that. We could in fact do an entire TEDx on rejection. You know, guy goes into his publishing company, big marble entrance hall, security guy says, "Who have you come to see?" He said, "Well, I've come to see my editor, I've sent in my manuscript." Security guy looks on the computer screen and says, "Well, I'm afraid your editor's not in, but I'll reject it if you like." And all that does is it tells you that you will be rejected by people who probably aren't as creative or as talented as you. And that, unfortunately, also often includes agents. So to end, I want to read you the best rejection letter I've ever seen. It comes from, apparently, from a Chinese economics journal, and it was as a result of someone submitting an article. "We have read your manuscript with boundless delight. If we were to publish your paper, it would be impossible for us to publish any work of a lower standard. As it is unthinkable that in the next 1,000 years we shall see its equal, we are, to our regret, compelled to return your divine composition and to beg you 1,000 times to overlook our short sight and timidity." So, on behalf of agents everywhere, to writers, please forgive us for our short sight and timidity. And if, while you're egotistically trying to get immortality, while you're trying to make the world a better place, while you're trying to get back at people who put you down, please don't forget you have to entertain us. You have to enable us to look at ourselves. Because when we're looking up at the screen, we're not looking at the actors who are saying your wonderful lines. We're not looking at the characters you have so lavishly and lovingly created. We're certainly not looking at you. We're looking at ourselves. Because only we are the storytellers, and only we can give you immortality. Thank you.